Hello. Thanks for joining me again. In our last 2 lectures on Buddhism, we're going to focus on 2 regions where distinctive forms of the religion took root, in Japan and in Tibet. And along the way, I'll try to dispel a few popular misconceptions. We can start with a little-known phenomenon. In the 11th and 12th centuries, many people in Japan thought the world was coming to an end. This was a time of transition from imperial rule during the Heian period to rule by the shogun and warlords in the Kamakura period, with their capital up near Tokyo. This was an age characterized by political upheaval, by violence and destruction and famine. Buddhist monks had calculated that the year 1052 marked the beginning of the last of the 3 long time periods predicted by the Buddha, this last one in which Buddhism itself would gradually decline and disappear. During this 3rd age, called Mappo, or the latter day of the law, people simply wouldn't be able to understand the dharma, that is Buddhist teachings, and they certainly wouldn't be able to put them into practice. One response to these worries in medieval Japan was to bury copies of Buddha sutras in mounds that looked like stupas. Okay, stupas are those traditional solid burial mounds that house the relics of the Buddha. And indeed, these sacred texts were thought to be embodiments of the Buddha, just as much as a relic, like a tooth or a finger bone might be, that are inside these stupas. Remember, stupas are solid. You don't go in them. There's just something buried inside. The sutras that were put inside were sometimes carved in stone or clay or bronze or copper, but most often they were written on costly silks or indigo-dyed paper with inks of black and gold or vermilion, sometimes mixed with blood. The paper and silk copies were placed inside ceramic or stone or bronze containers, and all the sutras were then buried in underground chambers lined with rocks and then covered over with that earthen mound that's like a stupa. The idea was to preserve these sacred texts through the era of religious confusion until the time when a future Buddha would be able to use them to teach the Dharma again to a receptive audience. In any case, it was thought that copying and preserving sutras were meritorious acts that would bring good karma. Remember the cult of the book from the last lecture. Over 200 of these sutra burial sites have been discovered all over Japan. Okay, and then the question is, which sutras were they transcribing and then hiding away for future generations? The most popular, of course, was the Lotus Sutra, which we talked about in a previous lecture. But also commonly buried were the 3 Pure Land Sutras. These are the larger Pure Land Sutra, that's sometimes called the Sutra of Immeasurable Life, then the smaller Pure Land Sutra, or the Amida Sutra, and finally, the Sutra of Meditation on Amida Buddha. These 3 texts constitute an alternative reaction to social breakdown and religious controversy. Their message is that the world is so corrupt and the scriptures are so hard to understand and Buddhist principles are so difficult to put into practice. Why even bother? Since in a degenerate age, it's impossible to gain enlightenment through one's own efforts, our only recourse is to rely on the grace of Amida Buddha, who's known in China as Amitabha. And that name means the Buddha of infinite light. Mahayana Buddhism had introduced the idea of multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in other parts of the universe. Some of those beings had created Buddha fields, or pure lands, and people of ordinary moral capacities, or even grievous sinners, could ask to be reborn not in this world of pain and sorrow, not to come back to this same world, but instead to be reborn in one of those celestial realms. And the most famous of those was the Western paradise of Amida, or the land of bliss. It's like heaven, but not in the Christian sense, because it doesn't last forever. Rather, this land of bliss is a place where individuals can go, so you'll be reborn into this Buddhist paradise, and there you can enjoy a pleasant environment in which to learn the Dharma and to gain enlightenment at your own pace. And eventually, beings who are reborn in the Pure Land will go directly from that paradise into nirvana. They won't pass go. They won't come back to this world. The Pure Land Sutras offer detailed accounts of how wonderful this region is. It's lovely, it's fertile, it's filled with streams and flowers and fruits and colorful, bejeweled trees. There are beautiful parks and pools and palaces. The air is filled with music and delightful fragrances. And everywhere one hears the truths about the six perfections, about non-existence and no self, about friendliness and compassion and sympathetic joy and so forth. Even the birds chirp the dharma, it's said, though these birds were magically conjured by Amida. They're not real birds. There are no animals in the land of bliss because those would be beings who had been reborn into a lower karmic existence, right? Only humans and gods exist in the Pure Land. And then maybe these illusions of birds. These Pure Land scriptures are not terribly long texts, but there's enough detail that one can almost see the Pure Land in one's mind's eye, which is part of the point. These texts can be used as aids to meditation and visualization. But the most prominent practice associated with Pure Land Buddhism is the Nembutsu. Okay, let me explain that term. The larger Pure Land Sutra enumerates the 48 vows that Amida took in a previous lifetime before he became a bodhisattva. And the 18th of those vows states, if, when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 directions who sincerely and joyfully entrust themselves to me, who desire to be born in my land and call on my name even 10 times, if those beings should not be born there, may I not attain perfect enlightenment. So wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you've done, if you call on Amida 10 times in sincerity, then you're in. And the customary prayer to say is Namu Amida Butsu, which is translated as Hail to the Amida Buddha. The larger and smaller Pure Land Sutras originated in India around 200 of the Common Era, while the Meditation Sutra seems to have been written in Central Asia or in China. But it's in medieval Japan, in that era of political and spiritual crisis that had people so worried. It's there that they gained their greatest popularity. A 12th century Buddhist monk named Honen founded the Pure Land School in Japan when he encouraged his followers to disregard traditional practices such as meditation and good works and chanting scriptures and simply focus on reciting the Nembutsu. If 10 times was the minimum, right? If someone calls on me 10 times in faith and then Amida promises he'll save them. If 10 times is the minimum, wouldn't 1,000 times be better just to hedge your bets? Or what about 1,000 times a day? Or 10,000 times a day? I mean, isn't rebirth in that Pure Land worth any effort? A generation later, Honen's disciple Shinran argued that true faith wouldn't feel the need for ceaseless repetitions. I mean, people started saying Namu Amida Butsu tens of thousands of times a day. He said, calling on Amida even once in full sincerity would be enough. So Shinran gave up monasticism, he married, and he founded the true Pure Land School. And this is perhaps the most widely practiced form of Buddhism in Japan today. But the most famous type of Japanese Buddhism is probably Zen. Once again, it had its origins in China, and it also was a response to theological and scriptural perplexity. With so many scriptures in the Mahayana tradition, advocating so many seemingly contradictory positions, some Buddhists looked for a more direct path to enlightenment. Zen Buddhism focused on meditation under the personal guidance of someone who himself or herself was already enlightened. The word Zen is a Japanese form of the Chinese Chan, which in turn is derived from the Sanskrit jhana, and that refers to a mind that's absorbed in meditation. The school had its origins in China, where Mahayana Buddhism was influenced by Taoism, especially in its idea of wordless teaching. And we'll hear more about Taoism in a future lecture. There are also legends that trace the beginning of this school to when the Indian monk Bodhidharma came from the West China in the early 5th century. Bodhidharma became known as the first patriarch. And then this is important in Zen Buddhism, is there's a transmission lineage, whereby the true teachings you can trace back to a teacher who gets it from a teacher to a teacher, all the way back to Bodhidharma. A famous definition of Zen is sometimes attributed to Bodhidharma, though it actually dates from several centuries later. And it says, a special transmission outside the scriptures, without depending on words and letters, pointing directly to the human mind, seeing the innate nature, one becomes a Buddha. Okay, it's a nice little description, and it talks about being beyond words and such, but it's ironic that a religious tradition that's primarily inward-looking, that generally disregards scripture, itself developed a body of authoritative sacred texts. That is, there are Zen scriptures, which eventually became part of the Chinese Buddhist canon. The most famous of these scriptures is the Platform Sutra of the 6th Patriarch, written about 780. Okay, this text is quite unusual because most sutras are presented as the words of the historical Buddha, as heard and then recounted by Ananda, or perhaps by a bodhisattva, a celestial being. I mean, this is true even of the Pure Land Sutras. They still start out, thus have I heard the Buddha was, at a certain place and this is what he taught. The Platform Sutra, by contrast, is a sermon given in the 7th century by the Zen patriarch Huineng. It doesn't even pretend to go back to Siddhartha Gautama. In this sermon, Huineng recounts how he was once an illiterate gatherer of firewood who happened to hear the Diamond Sutra being recited, and as he overheard this, his mind was awakened. He traveled to a monastery where he worked for 8 months as help in the kitchen. When the 5th Patriarch, who was in charge of the monastery, was about to die, he asked his disciples to write poems that would indicate their level of spiritual progress. Everyone hesitated. They didn't really want to put themselves out there. And finally, the head monk, Shunsho, eventually wrote a poem anonymously on a wall in the middle of the night. So he's going to try to sneak in something here. And his poem said this: the body is the tree of perfect wisdom. The mind is the stand of a bright mirror. At all times, diligently wipe it. Do not allow it to become dusty. The next morning, back in the kitchen, Huineng heard a boy recite this poem that had been found on this wall and that people had memorized. And Huineng realized that the verse was insightful, but it didn't seem to completely catch the whole truth. So Huineng composed his own poem and had somebody write it on the wall for him. Remember that Huineng himself is illiterate. And Huineng's poem went this way: fundamentally, perfect wisdom has no tree, nor has the bright mirror any stand. Buddha nature is forever clear and pure. Where is there any dust? So where the first poem offers a purification model of enlightenment through diligent practice, remember that it's wiping that mirror and keeping it clean, Huineng's poem suggests that enlightenment comes from recognizing reality, by seeing beyond the ordinary distinctions that we make in life. And that realization can come quickly, in a manner reminiscent of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. When the 5th Patriarch saw Huineng's poem written there on the wall, he recognized its profound understanding, and then he summoned Huineng secretly. The Patriarch then explained the Diamond Sutra to Huineng, and he gave him the robe of transmission to show that he's his legitimate successor, and he appointed him as the next one in line, as the 6th Patriarch, and then he sent him away. I think the idea was that he didn't want to upset the regular monks by promoting the kitchen help over them, or by acknowledging the superiority of the understanding, of the spiritual enlightenment of this young illiterate young man. As you might imagine, this whole scripture, the Platform Sutra, was written by later followers of Huineng to defend his claims to leadership over those of Shunsho, the monk who wrote the first poem. It's often regarded as promoting the idea of sudden enlightenment over gradual enlightenment, though some scholars have suggested that the Platform Sutra actually appears to transcend those theological distinctions and find room for both constant practice and for liberating insight. The Platform Sutra continues for a couple dozen more pages, explaining how meditation and wisdom can work together, how steady alertness should be matched by non-attachment, and how Zen understands Mahayana doctrines such as the three bodies of the Buddha, the Bodhisattva vows, and perfect wisdom. Zen became the dominant form of Buddhism in China in the 12th century, at a time when Buddhist monks were traveling from Japan to China seeking the full dharma. Eventually, Zen declined in China with the rise of Neo-Confucianism, and we'll hear more about that philosophy in Lecture 21. But Zen really came into its own once it got to Japan. Not only was its meditational and ethical discipline attractive to samurai, samurai are that warrior class, and meditation is tough. It takes a lot of discipline, and the samurai responded to that. But also, the aesthetic sense of Zen Buddhism became fundamental in Japanese art, in music, in drama, in tea drinking, and even in archery and swordsmanship. In all of those art forms or activities, there's an emphasis on what's deliberate and spare and calm and focused. And that's what's responded to in its connections with Zen Buddhism. There were two monks who were chiefly responsible for bringing Zen to Japan. The first was Eisai, and he lived in the late 12th century, and he advocated the Rinzai school of sudden enlightenment. And the second monk was Dogen. He lives in the 13th century, and he's the founder of the Soto school of gradual enlightenment. Both Zen traditions emphasized experiential understanding through meditation, and they downplayed scripture study or discursive thought and philosophical analysis. Both schools also stressed the importance of the master-disciple relationship. So monks would practice daily meditation and then have regular private interviews with their Zen teacher, who could evaluate and guide their practice. These interviews often included rather cryptic exchanges, since enlightenment isn't something that can be attained through rational argument. And Rinzai masters, that's the sudden enlightenment school, in particular were known for teaching through silence, or by shouting, or through unexpected, even bizarre actions. Unlike the Soto school of gradual enlightenment, where students were encouraged just to sit in the lotus position with an empty, calm mind, Rinzai teachers encouraged their disciples to meditate on koan. These are paradoxical sayings or narratives that could jolt one from ordinary modes of thinking. Inevitably, stories of how famous Zen masters became enlightened and taught others were collected and then canonized. An example of this is the 30 volumes of something called the Transmission of the Lamp. It was put together about 10,000 or 1,004, however you'd say that year. Two of the most famous compilations are the 100 koan in the Blue Cliff Record from the 12th century and the 48 koan of the Gateless Barrier in the 13th century. The Gateless Barrier is often known by its Japanese name, the Mumonkan. I'll give just one example from the Mumonkan, koan number 7. It says this: "A monk said to Joshu, 'I've just entered this monastery. Please teach me.' And Joshu responds, 'Have you eaten your rice porridge?' 'Yes, I have,' replied the monk. 'Then you had better wash your bowl,' said Joshu. And with this, the monk gained insight." Okay, clearly, this is more than just small talk about breakfast. Something else much more profound is going on here. Now, it's tempting to analyze this logically as a metaphor, to say, oh, that bowl must have represented his mind or his body, and the rice porridge maybe enlightenment or teachings, but I'm not sure that's quite the right way to go about all of this. This story somehow offers insight into ultimate reality. Somehow, the monk already has what he was looking for. The monk Mumon added this verse as a commentary to that particular story. "It is too clear, and so it's hard to see. A dunce once searched for a fire with a lighted lantern. Had he known what fire was, he could have cooked his rice much sooner." it's kind of a striking image, is somebody wandering around looking for fire when he's got fire within his, a flame within his lamp already. And the idea is that somehow this young monk who came to the monastery already had the enlightenment that he was looking for. He just didn't realize it yet. But perhaps even with that, I'm trying to be too logical in my analysis. Okay, are you ready to dispel some misconceptions? Despite its prominence in Japanese culture, Zen Buddhism is not uniquely Japanese. Remember, it originally came from China. Zen isn't the only type of Buddhism in Japan. There's still Pure Land Buddhism and Nichiren Buddhism. It's not a major division of Buddhism. Zen is just one of many schools within the Mahayana tradition. And Zen doesn't entirely reject doctrine or scriptures. There is a famous story of the Zen master Taksan burning his commentaries on the Diamond Sutra. But the idea is not that sacred texts are worthless, but rather they're inadequate. What's really needed is a direct mind-to-mind transmission. That's the only way that enlightenment can come about. Yet we've seen how Huineng, the sixth Zen patriarch, was first awakened when he heard the Diamond Sutra. And then he quoted regularly from the Vimalakirti Sutra in the sermon recorded in the Platform Sutra. You may remember that Vimalakirti was the enlightened layperson who exhibited his superior understanding of the principle of non-duality by saying nothing. And Huineng himself had been a layperson when he first heard the Diamond Sutra and his mind was awakened. Huineng and other Zen masters such as Dogen assumed that their students would start their spiritual quest with the scriptures. And then Zen itself developed a large body of sacred texts to study and to meditate upon. We've gone into a lot of details here, so it might be good to step back for a moment for a broader perspective. Whether or not you believe that enlightenment or nirvana is accessible through meditation, calling upon Amida and reciting the Diamond Sutra or copying the Lotus Sutra, whether you hold to any of those, it's still clear that the Buddhist canon asks and then answers some of life's most profound questions. Questions like, is there a reality beyond the ordinary existence that we see day to day? How does the mind shape and perhaps limit our perceptions of reality? What's the right balance between study and experience in learning something new? It's a question that I often ask when I'm trying to arrange classes or activities for my students. How much is in study and experience related? Another question, can salvation, however one defines it, be gained through one's own efforts, or is it necessary to rely on a higher power or a teacher? Are some of the most important truths in life unseen because they're right in front of us? If only we could recognize them. It's like looking for the fire with a lantern. And for this course, how important really are sacred texts in gaining insight or wisdom? Are they ultimately dispensable, like a raft that you can leave behind after you've reached the other shore of a river? That's an image from the Diamond Sutra, and it appears in other earlier Theravada sutras. Or are the scriptures so crucial that they deserve elaborate ritual burials to preserve them for future generations, as we saw at the beginning of this lecture? On the one hand, you get the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment, much beloved by Zen Buddhists, which suggests that the scriptures can themselves be a distraction. That sutra says, in teaching the sutras, the teaching in the sutras is like a moon-pointing finger. On seeing the moon, one knows what is marked as such by the finger is, after all, not the moon. The various speeches by all the Tathagatas for instructing the Bodhisattvas are to be taken likewise. Okay, the idea of that quote is it's like a child seeing a parent point and say, "Look at the moon." That child might mistake the finger for the moon. Okay, forget about the finger. Don't focus on the scriptures. Look at what they're pointing towards. On the other side are people like the Chinese monk Fa Xian in 399. So this side is people who take the scriptures very, very seriously. When Fa Xian was over 60 years old, he left the capital of China at Chang'an and headed west, headed out of China. For a couple of centuries, trade goods such as glass, coral, amber, perfumes, and precious metals had been coming in from unknown lands to the West, along with this new religion of Buddhism. But the transmission was somewhat fragmentary. Although the Chinese had a number of Buddhist scriptures, the translations weren't very good, and the doctrines in those books seemed to contradict each other. Fa Xian, as an experienced monk, was particularly concerned that the Chinese were lacking authoritative Vinaya texts. He knew that he needed to get to India, so he set off on foot, following the Silk Road through deserts and over mountains covered in snow all year. He crossed rivers, and at one point he climbed down 700 ladders that were attached to cliffs, which must have been terrifying. Fa Xian traveled through 30 different kingdoms in present-day China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. He visited holy sites and studied with various teachers, and then he sailed home on ships that stopped at Sri Lanka and Indonesia with his precious cargo of Buddhist relics and images and scriptures that he collected over the years. At one point on his return journey, a fierce storm arose and the ship sprang a leak. The merchants, terrified, threw their goods and their merchandise overboard to lighten the ship. Fa Xian tossed his cup and his wash basin into the sea, but he refused to part with anything else, praying fervently to the Bodhisattva Guanyin, saying, "I have wandered far and wide in search of the law. Oh, would that by your spiritual power you would turn back the flowing of the water." I guess that's stop the leak, and cause us to reach some resting place. After 13 more days of being blown this way and that, they finally reached a small island and everyone survived. Eventually, Fa Xian made it back to China at the age of 77. Altogether, his journey had taken him 14 years, and he'd covered more than 8,000 miles. Fa Xian spent the rest of his life translating into Chinese the Sanskrit text that he had so laboriously acquired. And he wrote an account of his travels, which itself became part of the Buddhist canon. It's a great travel story. One of my favorite quotes from Fa Xian's travel memoirs is, "In the desert were numerous evil spirits and scorching winds, causing death to anyone who would meet them. Above there were no birds, while on the ground there were no animals. One looked as far as one could in all directions for a path to cross, but there was none to choose. Only the dried bones of the dead served as indications." Okay, kind of a harrowing journey, at least at some points. I find myself incredibly moved by Fa Xian's account of his visit to Vulture Peak, where the Buddha was thought to have taught the Lotus Sutra originally. Speaking of himself in the third person, Fa Xian says, "Fa Xian, having bought flowers, incense, oil, and lamps in Newtown, procured the assistance of 2 aged monks to accompany him to the top of the peak. Having arrived there, he offered his flowers and incense and lit his lamps so that their combined luster illuminated the gloom of the cave. Fa Xian was deeply moved, even till the tears coursed down his cheeks, and he said, 'Here it was in bygone days Buddha dwelt and delivered the Surangama Sutra. Fa Xian, not privileged to be born at a time when Buddha lived, can but gaze on the traces of his presence and the place which he occupied.' And then taking his position in front of the cave, he recited the Surangama Sutra and remained there the entire night." But that's always the pilgrim's lament, isn't it? I mean, a pilgrim is somebody who says, "Here I am, finally, in the right place, but at the wrong time. If only I had been standing at this exact spot when whatever happened that was important in that particular tradition." Actually, I myself, a few years ago, was able to travel to Vulture Peak. And I stood there and realized that I had missed not only the Buddha, but I had missed Fa Xian as well. In Fa Xian's day, at the time when he was there, all that remained were, as he says, traces of the Buddha's presence. But those traces included the scriptures that preserved his words, the scriptures that Fa Xian had recited while he was there. And those sacred texts to Fa Xian were worth a decade and a half of untold hardships and dangers as he made his way across Asia and back, followed by more years of meticulous study and translation. So my last questions for you are, how far would you be willing to go for knowledge and wisdom? What risks would you take? And if you thought there were books that were essential to that quest, how would you treat them?